This is David Harvey, and you're listening to the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a podcast that looks at capitalism through a Marxist lens. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work. Today I want to get into the topic of the geography and geopolitics of capital. I do that, of course, because in part I come from a geographical background, so I've always got to insert some geography into it. But I think actually it's a very important topic, and one which is very relevant to understanding the contemporary condition. Now, in order to approach this from a Marxist standpoint, I think it's always important to recognize that Marx started Capital with the argument that the capitalist mode of production is a mode of production in which wealth is actually measured or appears in the form of commodities. And so Marx starts the Capital with the theory of the commodity. And one of the things I found very interesting in the last book I did was that there's a lengthy discussion of the commodity in one of Shakespeare's plays. And since Marx loved these kinds of references, I thought I'd actually start by doing a little Shakespearean reading of this topic from King John. Here it goes. Mad world, mad kings, mad composition. That smooth-faced gentleman, tickling commodity. Commodity, the bias of the world. The world, who is of itself is paised well, made to run even upon even ground, till this advantage, this vile drawing bias, this sway of motion, this commodity, makes it take heed from all indifferency, from all direction, purpose, course, intent. And this same bias, this commodity, this board, this broker, this all-changing word. And why rail I on this commodity? But for because he hath not wooed me yet, not that I have the power to clutch my hand when his fair angels would salute my palm, but for my hand is unattempted yet, like a poor beggar raileth on the rich. Well, whilst I'm a beggar, I will rail and say, here is no sin but to be rich. And being rich my virtue then shall be, to say there is no vice but beggary. Since kings break faith upon commodity, gain be my lord, for I will worship thee. Now, Shakespeare was writing this at a very, very interesting time in history when capital was just beginning to assert itself and commodity culture was just beginning to enter into the scene, and the monetization of everything began to be very significant. Before that, people, in effect, addressed their thinking and their loyalties to kin and to family. And this difference between loyalty to family and the chase and pursuit of monetary gain, this distinction is something which becomes very strong, of course, in many of Shakespeare's plays. And it's something that is, of course, registered today if you watch the TV series on Game of Thrones. It's all about loyalty to family and family name. It's the Lannisters versus the Starks versus the Tyrells, etc. And people's loyalty was to the house, to the popular, to a person or to a family. And this was very different from the gold, which does enter into the Game of Thrones, but was also entering in, of course, in Shakespeare's time. But this distinction between, if you like, two foci of interest, the family, which was located in a particular place and space and time, and therefore was often defined territorially. So the Starks are in the north and the Lannisters are in the south, and, all those kinds of things. So there is a territorial structure to those loyalties. And of course, there were wars going on all of the time between these different territorial structures. And in the European situation, these wars were sort of incoherent and they were bouncing in different alliances, a bit like the kind of things you see in the Game of Thrones, which gets very confusing because you're not quite sure who's backing whom and why they're switching sides and the like. But this was all settled in the European context by the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which brought to the end of a long, long period of wars of religion, wars of ethnicity, wars between clans, wars between everybody, and basically settled on the idea that there should be something called the state, the nation state, within which there would be sovereignty. And the sovereignty was such that people would be citizens of that state. And so you could clearly understand. And the general idea behind the Treaty of Westphalia was that every state should actually respect the integrity and the borders of every other state. Now, that didn't always hold in subsequent history, obviously, but nevertheless, this was, I think, a very important settlement, which actually clarified the territorial structures of power. Now, this led me to think quite a lot in my work about the distinction between what I call a territorial logic of power, which is the attempt to create within a territory, under the rubric of a nation state or a state, some kind of configuration of power which would be able to project itself onto the world around it. And therefore, that logic of power was going to be about military presence. It was going to be about superior education. It was going to be about superior culture, and it was going to be about trying to actually create a perfect state, an ideal state, if you want to call it that. And in order to do that, you had to develop institutions, you had to develop certain hierarchical structures of command and control within the state, and this became then one of the features of capitalist power. Now, Marx didn't do much with this idea of the territorial structures of power. Marx mainly talks about another source of power, which is a source of power that lies with the commodity, the source of power that lies with money and gold and the like. And that source of power becomes terribly important in order to understand the logic of what is happening in the world. We have a phrase. When you're stuck with a kind of conundrum, people turn to you and say, well, if you want to find out what's going on here, follow the money. When you follow the money, you'll find out who's really doing what behind where. Now, there are, I think, these two logics of power. One, a territorial logic of power, and the other, this capitalist logic of power, which is the power which is inherent in the accumulation of capital. So as an individual, you can have immense power because you've become one of those 8 billionaires that control sort of 80% of whatever it is of the world's resources. And as such, of course, you wield this power, but you wield it in a context where there are these other forms of power around. And so there's often a real bit of a problem about how the billionaires relate to the territorial state power. And of course, one of the ways in which they relate to it is that they turn the state into an agent of their own interest. But state power is rather more complicated than that, because the state houses a population, and the billionaires may not be popular with the population. And so the big question is the legitimacy of who has power within the state. And so there's a contest all the time about how that monetary power is used within the state apparatus. So when you think about these two logics of power, you then say, well, what's the relationship going on between them? And I think it's very important when you do something like this to kind of say they're not separate from each other. They're constantly in relationship to each other. So that, for example, an affluent class will set up international institutions which will somehow or other regulate what's happening in the monetary field, but regulate it in such a way as to somehow or other be significantly influential over who has a territorial logic of power greater than somebody else. So an institution of that sort, which is very important in our contemporary world, will be the International Monetary Fund. The International Monetary Fund plays a very important role in regulating how, if you like, the rule of law on how monetary exchanges shall occur across the globe. There are other institutions like the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, which similarly exercises that kind of power. There is the World Bank. There are many of these institutions. There are interesting forms of what you might almost call monopoly power at this level, which are private institutions, but they're actually global in reach. I think one of the most powerful institutions in our own society is McKinsey, which is a sort of an accounting firm, but also a consultancy firm. So anybody who comes to power generally calls in McKinsey and says, what should we do? And McKinsey gives them the sort of neoliberal recipe, and so everybody then implements the McKinsey program. I've often fantasized with some colleagues about we should have a left-wing McKinsey, so that when somebody comes into power who has real left-wing instances, they've got a consultancy organization that can come in and say, okay, here's the left-wing answer, not the neoliberal answer. And this kind of relationship between territorial structures of power and the capitalist logic of power is, I think, is something that we really have to pay careful attention to. In doing so, one of the things I do is to start to say, well, when you start to look at the capitalist logic of power, Marx actually argues that capital is value in motion, and that there's therefore within capitalism a motion of money, a motion of commodities, a motion of production, a motion of the factors of production like labor and resources and all the rest of it, so that you're actually when you're dealing with the monetary forms of power, not in something that is static or is contained, but something that's constantly in motion. And one of the things that's very difficult for a state to do is to prevent the motion. There was a wonderful moment, I remember, when Mitterrand in France became president of France and decided he was going to really try and implement a socialist program. And one of the things he did was to nationalize the banks and the like. And what he had to do was to try to control the flight of capital. That capital just was flashing out of the country like crazy because he didn't want to live in this world which was, controlled in this socialistic kind of manner. So in order to prevent capital flight, he had to start to put on capital controls. And one of the forms of capital control that he found very difficult to do was the use of credit cards. Now, at that time, back in the 1980s, credit cards were not quite as popular as they are now, but in France, the carte bleue, as it was called, which is a kind of a Visa credit card, was very popular in France. And of course, people used it when they went on holidays and when they were on vacations. They took their carte bleue and they played with the card. Well, Mitterrand had to control the use of carte bleue. Now, when you do that, the whole population in France was kind of absolutely outraged. And so within, a few months, Mitterrand had to actually realize that he couldn't control the flight of capital out of the country and that he had to reverse. And he then got rid of the nationalization of the banks and became a good neoliberal subject. This was a situation where capital flow disciplined the state apparatus. And one of the things we've got to look at right now is the relative form of power between capital flow as a powerful force regulating what happens in the global economy and territorial power. And I think one of the big arguments that has to be said about the neoliberal period is that the state, in many ways, has become an agent of monetary power, that the bondholders actually control the power, not the state itself. And there was a wonderful moment when Clinton came to power, and there's an apocryphal story. He's just been elected. He starts to outline his economic program, and his economic advisors, most notably Robert Rubin, who came from Goldman Sachs, looked at him and said, "You can't do that economic program." And Clinton said, why not? And Rubin said something like, well, Wall Street won't let you. And Clinton kind of said, you mean to say that my whole economic program and all my prospects for re-election are dependent on a bunch of fucking bond traders? And Robert Rubin apparently said, yes. So Clinton came in promising universal health care and all kinds of wonderful things. And what did he give us? He gave us NAFTA. He gave us the reform of the welfare system, so it became much more punitive. He gave us the reform of the criminal justice system that started sending people in mass incarceration. He gave us the WTO at the end of his. They repealed Glass-Steagall, which is one of the things that the financiers wanted. In other words, he implemented a whole program which was what Goldman Sachs wanted. And it's interesting, actually, in the United States, there's been very, very few moments in U.S. history since Clinton where the Secretary of the Treasury has not come from Goldman Sachs. And I think that this is a very important indicator of the way in which the bondholders actually contain what can be done in state power. Now, when you say this in the United States, of course, everybody looks at you and says, well, that's a conspiratorial kind of position and all the rest of it. And nobody really believes you very much. But you go to Greece and you ask them, does your government control things here? Or do the bondholders, who actually forced all of this austerity down your throat and have been doing it since 2011, are they the ones in control? Who's really in control here? Well, it turns out, of course, it's the bondholders. And I think everybody in Greece knows that. And, of course, the socialist government there, Syriza, is really stuck with having to implement all the time measures which, in effect, are demanded by the bondholders. And there are interesting struggles in Europe going on. In Italy right now, there's this whole kind of struggle because the bondholders are essentially saying one thing, not directly, but through the European institutions. Because what happened over the Greece thing was something very interesting. That the indebtedness of Greece, which was a real serious problem, no question about it, the indebtedness was really indebtedness to the European banks, particularly the German and the French banks. Now, if Greece had declared default in 2011, that would have meant that actually the French and the German banks would have been really screwed. And German government and everybody else would have had to bail out the banks because they had got these really bad debts that was not being paid by Greece. But there was all this pressure on Greece not to default. And they were promised again and again and again they would get help from the European Union. But what really happened was not help from the European Union. The debt owed to the banks was transferred from the banks to these international institutions, the European Central Bank, the European Stabilization Fund, and the International Monetary Fund. So instead of the banks going bankrupt, what happened was there were formation of international institutions which put then the austerity package together and said to Greece, this is what you have to do. You have to privatize. You have to sell all of these goods, and you have to privatize. Even the Parthenon was talk about whether we should privatize that. So Greece was put into this situation. So if you said to the Greeks, look, who's in control here? Your government or the bondholders, I think you would get a very, very clear answer. And I think that actually this turns out to be very much the situation globally right now. Now, this global situation says that accumulation of capital is going to be dependent upon the way in which territorial governments respond to that accumulation of capital. So what do we see? We see a large corporation. The most recent example we have in the United States is Foxconn. And it says to Wisconsin, we'll come and build a factory in Wisconsin. Or Amazon says, we're thinking of setting up a big place. So which place will provide us with all the help and all of the funds we need. So in effect, what large corporations can do is to sit there and say, well, okay, we have all of these places where we can go. Which one of you will give us the best deal? And Amazon actually really set out that way and basically announced that it was going to set up some new campus, and it invited bids. Foxconn negotiated with Wisconsin, and Wisconsin was very happy, and they decided they would give Foxconn $4 billion to come and set up a factory. Now, Foxconn is interesting because much of Foxconn's work is in China, but Foxconn is a Taiwanese firm. So it's a Taiwanese firm with major operations in China that is actually now setting up, possibly, in Wisconsin, but only provided that it is given a lot of subsidies and all the rest of it. And so there are these calculations that say, I don't know, actually this is costing about, I don't know, $4,000 a year per job or something of that kind. And then, of course, Foxconn, having agreed to this, then turns around and says, oh, by the way, we're not actually going to manufacture anything there. We're just going to simply use it as a research campus and all the rest of it. So the power relation between the territorial entity and the corporation or the money power, that power relation is constantly moving around us. And therefore, what this does is not to make territories irrelevant. And this is one of the big things that was said in the 1980s. You know, territorial power is irrelevant. We don't care about the state anymore. All the power lies elsewhere. Well, actually, in a funny kind of way, by power moving towards finance and monetary forms and to big corporations, actually small geographical differences became even more important than they were before. Because what the large corporation would look for would be, what are the advantages of being located in this space as opposed to that space? And if there was just a small tax advantage between this space and that space, you would go to that space, which would mean that this space would then say, well, we have to change our taxation arrangements so that they will come back from that space and come to this place. And then so you get actually inter-urban and inter-regional and international competition between states to try to attract foreign investment. And this is one of the big aims of state power right now. Now, this was not the case in the 1950s and 1960s, because the state at that point was much more social democratic. So part of what the state was trying to do was to guarantee well-being to the mass of its population. It didn't always work, and yes, indeed, there were certain kind of problems. Also, back in the 1960s and 1970s, there were strong capital controls, so that you couldn't move money around the world as easily as you can now. I remember the first time I went to the continent, I'm old enough to remember this, you see, back in the 1950s, the first time I went to France, I had to go to the bank in order to get traveller's checks. I was only allowed £40 of traveller's checks. And after I got the £40 of traveller's checks, they stamped £40 in the back of my passport, and that meant I could not get another £40 until the following year. Now, if you say to anybody right now that you lived in a world where that sort of thing went on, but when I was a kid, that's what we did. I mean, I had my £40 of traveller's checks, and that was all I could. So everybody in Britain was living under a regime of capital controls, and capital controls were consistent, if you like, with that Bretton Woods agreement that was made in 1945 about how the international monetary system would kind of work. Now, that all broke down at the end of the 1960s into the 1970s, and after that we started to get much more fluid movement of money. Now, this then brings us to the question of the geographical movement of capital. Now, capital assumes three primary forms. One is money, the second is as commodity, and the third is as production. Now, which one of those forms of capital is most easily moved? Well, turns out it's the money form. the way I kind of think of it is I think of money as the butterfly form of capital. It flits around the world, and then it sees a sort of tempting flower, and it lands on that, and then it picks up again and flies off somewhere else. The commodity is the caterpillar form of capital. It sort of crawls around rather slowly and is a bit sort of cumbrous and takes, when you have a lot of steel rods, you just can't sort of fit them around. The third form of capital, production, is the least mobile. So you've got the three forms of capital. Which one of those forms dominates in a particular historical period is, I think, terribly significant, terribly important. Giovanni Arrighi had an interesting kind of theoretical argument. He said, capital reaches a point where actually it's got real difficulties of expansion in its production form, and its commodity form is kind of getting very sluggish. So when that happens, there's likely to be a push to create a more fluid financial system. And he documented that historically by kind of saying, well, actually, if you look at Venice and Genoa, you'll see they got to a point where they became basically financiers. Right? And as financiers, they started to actually then be much more interested in the movement of money. And I was always thinking about the Game of Thrones, just to go back to that, because the Iron Bank in the Game of Thrones at some point or other comes into the negotiations because they've got the money, and they therefore come into the thing. So the financialization that went on played a very important role in the movement of power in capital from the Italian city-states northward into Holland. And so the second period, if you like, of this was merchant capital focused on the Netherlands and the power of the Netherlands, and so you have Amsterdam and and all of the power of that, and then that reaches its limits, and you get another phase of financialization, which actually moves capital to Britain, in the sort of late 17th or late 18th century. And then, of course, there is the move of a financialized move from Britain to the United States. And the United States started to reach its limits in terms of its productive capacity, in terms of organizing, and in the 1980s. And so we start to see this strong movement into financialization. And the big question right now is, where's the finance actually going to go? And, of course, it goes to wherever the production capacities are best. And that happens, of course, to be China, which I talked about a couple of weeks ago. And I think that this is actually one of the situations we're in where a financialized capitalism is very fluid in terms of its, which flower is it going to alight upon, and where are conditions optimal for that development. And so this is the situation we're now in. So it's the money form of capital, which is actually re-territorializing structures of economic and political power. And I'll talk more about that next time. Thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to David Harvey's Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a Democracy at Work production. A special thank you to the wonderful Patreon community for supporting this project.